All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Get Rid Live, our live stream series here through the Writing Center and the Writing Department. It's Dr. Rich Shrevner. Hope you're all doing well. All right. So this week, we're back for another live stream, and the topic of this week is reviewing anti-racist publishing practices and editorial guidelines. We also have a guest chat with Jessica Taylor and Louie Manuba, who are editing and mentoring contributors for a new journal called the Environment from A to Z, or zine, as part of a humanities capstone project at York. So very delighted to always have guest speakers as well for this. We spoke with Sarah Garofalo last week, who is the editor-in-chief, or co-editor-in-chief rather, of the Excalibur, the student-run newspaper. So if you want to check that out, refer back to the stream on our channel. We had a great chat about what it means to write for a variety of audiences, especially audiences in a very accessible way. So there's a nice conversation about that, and also a preview about some of the content that's to come, including the segment and supplement they'll be publishing this month on Black history. So look out for that. That's an annual thing that they publish as part of the newspaper. Okay, so before we begin our main topic, I just want to cover some items that I always cover at the start of the stream. So I'd like to once again thank Writing Center Director John Suffren and the Writing Department for supporting another stream in term of Get Rid Live. If you'd like to see any of our past live streams, you can find them in two places. So on our YouTube channel, where you are right now, and on the Writing Center's page, which is right on the one that we're looking at here, just to my left or to your right. And so we have a couple awesome things coming up in the next few weeks. Today, as you know, we're looking at anti-racist publishing practices and editorial guidelines, the value of slow writing and writing with emotions. And we have guest speakers lined up for several of these ones coming up down the line. So do stay tuned for those. Again, these guest speakers really enrich the conversation. I certainly don't mind talking for, an hour about this stuff, but I love having that dialogue with people who are in the chat, as well as guest speakers who join us on various calls. Okay. And also, while you're on the Writing Center's page, just remember you can always sign up for a one-on-one session with our faculty in order to get feedback on writing assignments, whether you're just brainstorming or putting the final touches on an essay. And on this very page, you'll see one-on-one appointments and the links that take you there. So we do have live appointments, both in person and online. And we also have an online paper submission process where you can get feedback within 24 hours. All right. So let's dive into our topic for the day, reviewing anti-racist publishing practices and editorial guidelines. So for me, this topic was inspired by some recent calls in the field of writing studies for scholars and editors, authors as well, reviewers, to practice more inclusion in publishing, such as bringing on more BIPOC and multiple marginalized or underrepresented or MMU reviewers on editorial boards, and mentoring junior scholars, for example, pre-tenure faculty or undergraduate students, through rigorous submission processes. And so one key guide for addressing inclusion in publishing is the anti-racist scholarly reviewing practices, a heuristic for editors, reviewers, and authors. And so here's the link that I have on the page, and I will put it in the show description. I think I have not done that just yet. This was developed by a number of scholars across writing studies, from technical communication to rhetorical studies to composition studies. And again, seeing that there have been numerous stories that have emerged that speak back to these sort of racist moments we've seen in institutions, right? We've seen a lot of movements and calls for anti-racism movements and programs and so forth at universities, including at York. Hiring of more Black scholars, hiring of more BIPOC scholars, and as well as MMU scholars, new funds and so forth that will mentor scholars through projects, there's just a number of things sort of emerging that isn't unique to writing studies, but this is a very helpful guide, and it seems important for our fields, that is writing studies, to address these issues because we study writing in a variety of situations. And so what can we do to practice more inclusion? One way we could do that is by thinking through these scholarly reviewing practices. And though these are talking about reviewing practices, it applies to editors, reviewers, and authors. Okay, and I'm realizing on my screen that that is not quite pulling up, so let me just fix that real quick. If we go to window, I think that's when we can see it. There we go. Oh, okay. So now you can see all my tabs that we have here. Okay, so I was talking about this just a moment ago, but just for a recap, this is a open access document that will be linked in the show description. It's anti-racist scholarly reviewing practices, and it's become this useful toolkit for editors, reviewers, and authors. So a number of authors and scholars in the field of writing studies writ large across our subfields, technical communication and so forth, came together and put this together as a useful guide to send out to editors, reviewers, and authors. And so they're talking about why and how to use this document, that publishing practices and norms are context specific. So there isn't a universal rule for good writing, for example. They were seeing issues in which scholars were getting feedback from reviewers that was referencing the same sources over and over, kind of reaffirming whiteness a lot of times. Because of scholars of color, BIPOC scholars, MMU scholars, just weren't getting those citations because of past publishing practices. So I'm kind of grossly under summarizing, if you will, or summarizing what this document does, but it was just revelatory for me to look at and think about in my own practice, even calling out and pushing back racist editing practices. And that could mean a variety of things, right? But like, if they're saying you have bad grammar, or that, someone tells you, for example, as they talk about here in their stories, that you don't need to cite Black feminist scholars, but rather someone else because the article isn't about race, they're suggesting we kind of push back, right? And say, no, it's actually useful for me to do this. And this kind of gives, I think, reviewers, authors, and editors means to make these kind of calls, right? And given that this is endorsed largely by the fields, it seems a little less scary to make those kind of pushbacks. And so the variety of stories come out of here are really interesting. So, for example, a reviewer receives a book proposal on new work by a junior scholar that engages race and other explored areas. The proposal is well done and builds on recently published scholarship in TechCom. The reviewer is excited about the potential work. Later, she learns that the book was not accepted because the other reviewer didn't see its promise, and the editor presented the reviews as two equal opinions, but decided to reject. And so they're sketching out the stakes of when you have to make these calls as an editor, for example. Let's say you only have one reviewer that's been able to complete the review, and the other hasn't because they're caring for children amid a pandemic, as they sort of talk about here. The editor has to make these kind of judgment calls. What do you do in response? Do you give the one review and make the decision based on that? Or do you allow perhaps that BIPOC activist scholar more time to do the review so that you're following those transparent and fair processes? And once they sort of sketch these stories, then they offer a range of things we could do as writers, editors, reviewers to practice anti-racist scholarly reviewing practices. So a couple things I'll just highlight here that I think are very interesting, and there are many more interesting here, but we could spend a few hours working through this. Reviewers and editors resist reflexively suggesting that certain work is not within the purview of the fields. So this could be if it might be in the canon of writing studies, but it's drawing on scholars from kind of interdisciplinary background. It's not gesturing, well-cited works in the fields. For me, I'll give you an example of how this kind of works, and what I've had to work through recently is I study emotion, and I'm going to butcher their names, but they are very well known in the world of affect. There's Deleuze and Guattari, who are two scholars in philosophy who have long been cited across fields for recognizing the way the body is affected and affects people. And I just saw that happening way too much, and was recently asked to cite those scholars. I'm like, they're kind of overplayed. Like, they're interesting, don't get me wrong, but who can we look to more recently? And how might they tell us some really interesting things about the field? Excuse me. Lived experience as a source of expertise. So if it's ethnographic, for example, how might that be a useful method? Make reviewed processes transparent. So putting them out in public, gathering the reviews in a timely manner, making equity and inclusion practice explicit in review processes and procedures. So, for example, if you've, as a journal, have said, recently we've been hiring and looking to hire more BIPOC scholars as part of our editorial review board, you're acknowledging that you've had that gap. And then it goes on to speak to more mentorship throughout reinforcing, holding people to a standard of accessibility, requiring alt text, for example, for images, transcripts for multimedia, which enables disabled scholars to serve as reviewers and editorial board members. So kind of under this larger auspice of inclusion, we can do a variety of things. And I think that this doesn't just apply to our field. If you think about it, this could apply to a range of disciplines. And I'm guessing that it already is, or it's starting to make its way through there. Okay, so let's turn to that. And we're going to turn to our guest speaker here in just a minute. I can see Jess here on the call. So if you could just hang out for just a second, I want to mention a few more things and we will get to the discussion here. Okay. And I think that what I want to say is that calls like this and these heuristics are starting to materialize even at York. So, for example, my colleague Professor Stevie Bell, recently helped launch Scribe. It's a critical studies in writing programs and pedagogy. And so they are currently accepting submissions from scholars. And I think what's really interesting is they're doing translations of submissions. So offering that you can sort of have them in English, Spanish, French, what have you. And the whole purpose is to facilitate intercultural dialogue around the development of writing programs, writing centers, and writing pedagogy in post-secondary institutions of higher learning around the world. And so kind of thinking about things like English as a colonizing force or writing center approaches that are not foregrounded in North America, particularly the US, could lead to some interesting publications here. Also, York librarians have been working part of this month to address critical gaps in Black content, and so they are doing a Black History edit-a-thon, on Wikipedia and Wikidata. So, we're looking at some of the wiki approaches that they have here. Let me put this into my screen so we can see it. And it kicked off recently, and it's going to run through, they have several sort of sessions throughout the month. So if you're interested in those sort of things, do check those out. These are cool movements, and they're very intentional. Why not have a special section for BIPOC scholars and Black History Month? Acknowledging those kind of critical gaps could really shore up, voices that have been missing for a very long time, in whether it's Wikipedia or in journals. Okay, so some very cool things happening here. What I want to do is move to a discussion with our guest speakers to kind of shed light on what inclusion looks like. We're going to talk with Jessica Taylor and Louie Manuba, who are editing a forthcoming zine called Environment from A to Zine. And Jess, you're on the line with us, so I'll bring you in here. There we go.
Hey.
Hi. How's it going?
Good, good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah. So yeah, you and Louie are humanities majors, right? You're in your 5th year, as I understand, right? Do you want to tell me just a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So, yeah, I'm Jessica Taylor, Oliveira de Silva, technically, very long name. But I'm pretty much double majoring in humanities and professional writing. I finished up my professional writing degree last year, and I'm coming back for my 5th year just to kind of finish up all of my humanities degree. And that's where this project came in. It's really a project in conjunction with the humanities capstone that me and Louie are completing. Louie is I'm pretty sure he's graduating with an international humanities degree, which is also pretty exciting. Yeah.
Fantastic. I mean, and the idea of starting a journal and a zine specifically, it's a big undertaking to do this kind of stuff. But tell me about the project that you're working on, Environment from A to Zine. I'm going to pull it up here on the screen too while we have it.
Sure. So, like I said, it is in conjunction with a course at York. So the overall goal is to kind of create a shared understanding of a space or a topic, right? So that's why we're having the workshops with our to go along with our zine. And we picked a zine pretty much because not only because I have that professional writing background and I'm excited to publish some stuff, but also because historically zines have been a place for people who don't really get to represent themselves or get to have their voice heard in traditional media. It's an opportunity for people to just submit their thoughts and feelings about the environment and have it seen by a larger audience.
Yeah, I mean, and that's so exciting. And one thing that we sort of talked about before this was that you're inviting publics to contribute.
Yep.
But what I want to know kind of before this is, like, how do you think zines differ from traditional media such as magazines and online news?
So online news and magazines typically have submission guidelines that are pretty specific. So with us, it's kind of just like you need to tie it to one of our chapters some way, but your piece doesn't even necessarily need to be about the environment. It can be if you feel like there's something that's like more important to talk about right now. You can also just say like, hey, this zine is cool. This is, how I feel about the environment. These are my feelings about it. Hello?
Hey, Jess.
Hey.
Hey, I'm sorry.